Welcome to the Spy Who Raised Me podcast. Conversations between a daughter and her father. Yes, you've guessed it, he was a spy. Hi, I'm Jane Craigie and I'm with my dad on Zoom. My dad's called Iain Craigie and he spent most of his working life as a spy. And one of the things that is an enduring part of my dad is that he's got a real sense of adventure, always has had. And we're going to talk a little bit about his time when he was based, well, we were all based as a family in Istanbul, in Turkey. And we're also going to talk about some of the holidays that we had while we were living in Turkey. So Dad, when were you when were we in Istanbul, and what was the purpose of your mission there?
Yes, we were in Istanbul between 1973 and 1976. And
why were you there? What was the interest of GCHQ and the British government in Turkey?
Well, the background there was that Turkey is well situated. It's got seas on three sides, and it's got Russian interest throughout the whole of that area. So really what we were interested in was keeping an eye on what they were doing. And was that period in history was a time of great change. NATO had been set up after the Second World War, and the Warsaw Pact with countries like Albania, Poland, Hungary, East Germany, and Bulgaria, they were part of the Warsaw Pact. So in fact, there was a lot of jostling for power bases and so on at that time. So our function in Istanbul was to keep a lookout for what the Russians were doing, which countries they were interested in, and it was very much to do with Russia, but also Bulgaria, to some extent Romania. So we had those targets, and because of the program of development that Russia were embarked upon during that time. They were building a lot of ships. They were building a lot of connections with these various countries. So we were in a position where across the Black Sea, we could look at what the Russians were doing, plot their progress in various places and so on, check out what sort of armaments they were producing, and just generally keep a finger on the pulse of what we could expect in the years ahead.
And Dad, so part of what you're talking about is not just the listening function and the intelligence gathering from an electronic point of view, so listening to radio signals, etc. It was also about physically being present in that region. You know, Turkey is such an important country in so many ways, in that it's the bridge between the East and the West. It's the bridge between the European Union now and the rest of the Middle East, and it's also a country of great wealth, great resource. So not monetary resource, but in terms of what it can produce, in terms of water. Just tell us a little bit about why that physical placement in the Middle East was so important to you from an intelligence gathering perspective.
Well, Istanbul was ideally placed because the link from the Black Sea through to the Mediterranean has is through the Bosphorus into the Sea of Marmaris and then into the Mediterranean. And of course, we could both observe what the Russians were doing, especially with some of the ships that they were building. And I remember that the Kiev, which was built around 1975, I think.
Is that a boat, Dad? Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah, sorry, it was a boat. Yes, it was an aircraft carrier, and we knew that it was being built somewhere on the Crimean Peninsula, I think it was, and in fact the flat where we lived in Istanbul overlooked the site of the new Bosphorus Bridge, so we could sit on the balcony and look out. But if the Kiev was on manoeuvres, it used to appear on the left as we looked towards the east, coming down the Bosphorus, underneath the Bosphorus Bridge, which at that time was still being built. And so we had both physical confirmation of what was happening in that sense, but also the surveillance in other mediums, like satellite and so on, corroborated what was happening. But it was very interesting. It was very interesting too from a social background, because the Turks did not like the Russians. In fact, they hated the Russians. And of course, the Kiev sailing down beneath this wonderful bridge that was being built was anathema to the Turkish people and the workers who were employed on the bridge, and they did some quite disgusting things. They used to drop their trousers and crap on the ship as it went underneath, and peed. And if you get 50 or 60 or 100 workers doing that, you can imagine the Russians were not very happy. But of course, they couldn't do a damn thing about it. So
presumably the Kiev was a Russian aircraft carrier, was it?
Yes, it was a Russian aircraft carrier, and it eventually finished its maneuvers and went into the Med, and I think it went to the Far East, but I'm not sure.
And where was it built? Was it built in Russia?
It was built in Russia, yeah, and on the Crimea, because the Russians, of course, had facilities in Crimea. And as a matter of interest, that aircraft carrier finished up in, I think it was South Korea, and is now a tourist attraction. They converted it to some sort of grand hotel. So that's a little bit of social history.
Why, just explain a little bit about the relationship between the British government and the Turkish government, and why you were welcomed very much into the heart of the country and very much supporting them in their intelligence gathering and their military activity. What was that bond? How was that bond created, and what was it like to be a part of it?
Well, the Turkish government had interests themselves, of course, and keeping an eye on what the Russians were doing. So, in fact, we had from an early period an agreement with Turkey that we could use certain sites, predominantly overlooking the Black Sea because of the naval activity there that the Russians were conducting. And we had this agreement that we paid Turkey a sum of money, which is quite substantial, every 3 years, in what they called a memorandum of understanding. And the Turkish government and the general staff and so on, they used that money for whatever purpose they wanted. So they could buy arms, they could supply themselves with transport and so on, Land Rovers and what have you. So it was a well-established 3-yearly cycle, but it had to be said that as in a later podcast, we'll cover another part of my service overseas in Ankara. And Ankara, of course, was the diplomatic side, although there was a consulate in Istanbul. I got far more information from the diplomatic side of how the British government viewed the Turks and their application to join the common market, but also their position vis-a-vis the fact that they were the last bastion of NATO in that area. So they were the bridge between Asia and North America and European and Europe. So that was an ongoing thing, and I think quite a lot of people thought that the Turks were not fairly done by in some of those negotiations, because they had a seminal role there just through the geography, the fact that they linked in. I mean, they had, as I said, three seas around them, but towards the east they had borders with Syria and Iraq, and the Yemen. So that was always a big concern, and of course for Europe and NATO and various countries in America too, there was a sense of safety because of the barrier between those countries that might do some damage, and Turkey was that country.
And Dad, what's just listening to you talk about your time there and your role there, what's really apparent to me compared with the earlier podcasts is just that what is very obvious in that you were moving up the ranks in terms of seniority within the management of GCHQ, and what you've just outlined to us is your understanding of deeper levels of diplomacy and political negotiations between the two countries. And it's more of an observation really than asking you to comment on that. But what it does make me want to ask you is, what exactly was the team structure of you with your fellow intelligence gatherers and the diplomatic service in the British consulate in Istanbul? What was the setup? How many of you were there, and what were you doing on a day-to-day basis?
Well, I was my tag was senior officer Turkey, so I was in most ways responsible for the negotiations that went on a 3-yearly basis to agree the memorandum of understanding and the amount of money that would flow into the Turkish coffers. We had two sites on the Black Sea coast, one at Sinop, one at Ünye, which was some distance from Ankara, but was administered from Ankara, and the crossover between the diplomatic side and the operational side and the intelligence side was displayed in the meetings that we had with Foreign Office staff. So it wasn't a very heavy duty, in the sense that once an agreement had been reached for a 3-year period, it was more or less just a question of executing that. So we didn't have too much input from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office side, except that quite a few of the diplomats had their own view on what was happening, quite apart from the fact that they realized that it was intelligence gathering. Some of them, including one very senior member of the embassy when I was there who thought it was unfair that we were using Turkey in such a way so that we could keep a toehold and oversight of what the Russians were doing. So that, for me, was quite an interesting dimension, and it's one now that I think, when I look back, I'm not surprised that some of the diplomats had that view.
And Dad,
because
sorry to disturb, to interrupt your flow, but I was just really interested in that's the first time in our conversation that any conflict that has arisen as a concept between the diplomats and the intelligence gatherers within the British government. You have talked about the differences in backgrounds, but you haven't talked about any conflict or anything that might constitute conflict. Just explain that to us.
Well, I think that there are various intelligence committees in the UK, of course, within MI6 and other bodies, where discussion goes on at a high level, and they all have different viewpoints depending on what the various interests are. Some might be economic, some might be strategic. So really, it's a melting point for creating a plan that we could use on these negotiations with Turkey. And because of the nature of the ever-changing scene in the Middle East, there was that continual dialogue. And you can see that on the economic side and the political side and the socio-economic side, there would be a lot of people trying to defend their case. So I believe that, although I never attended any of these meetings, I believe they became quite fiery at times.
Well, I suppose you've got so many different departments with so many different objectives. It's just like you see in any political situation where different agendas will create conflict.
Yeah, of course, and you can see how Turkey's human rights situation has always been used as an excuse for not admitting them to the European Union. And like a lot of countries in the Middle East and elsewhere, they have a history of being quite fierce and retaliating when they had terrorist activity and so on. But when you look at it in the round, I think that the Turks do quite a lot for ensuring that for example, the immigration situation is moderated by their position and by the fact that they were willing to work with various governments to try and appease the huge problems of migrants moving from the east to the west.
And that's always been the case.
That's always been the case. And you can see now that Turkey has its own problems. They have the situation in the east of Turkey where the Kurdish nation was geographically, they own quite a part of eastern Turkey. And unfortunately, ill feeling between the Turkish government and the Kurds has led over the years to skirmishes, wars, terrorism, especially on part of the PKK in that area. So it's a very, very volatile area, and it's one that stretches Turkey's resources enormously because they're trying to keep up a surveillance system in the east of the country that can allow legitimate immigrants to come into Turkey, but there are so many areas, and the borders are so vast that trying to keep some semblance of fairness and so on is not easy for them.
No, not at all. And Dad, how many of you were there in your team, and what exactly were you doing whilst you were there?
Well, in Istanbul, we had 5 there who were involved in surveillance. That is keeping track of some of the interesting targets, Russian mainly, but also Bulgarian. Uh, troop movements, armaments, delivering consignments of armaments to some of the Warsaw Pact countries. So it was mainly that. As I say, there was also the fact that in physical terms, we had input from being in such a convenient place, watching what the Russians were doing and their access into the Mediterranean and elsewhere, which is always a difficulty for Russia because of their lack of deep sea ports and so on, giving them access to the seas.
Yeah, yeah. And Dad, it's the first time as well that you've mentioned a new technology in your armory, which is satellite. So when did the satellites start to be used by GCHQ? And what sort of technology was it back in the early 70s?
Yeah, the satellites were probably in the 70s, became a surveillance tool. And I mean, that, like everything else, took time to build up because of the nature of the difficulties rather of building satellites and getting them aloft. I mean, it took a lot of money, and the Americans were definitely in the forefront. So early on and through part of the 70s, it was almost a case of having to apply to NSA in America for time on the satellite. So if they had a satellite system that could view one of the targets that we were interested in, it wasn't a question of the UK being in control of that access. We had to apply to the Americans and say we would like to look at this particular aspect. It may have been the Kiev being built, or some such, or ships on maneuver in the Black Sea or in the Sea of Marmaris. So then we had to apply for a slot, as it were, and they would come back and say, yeah, you can have whatever it was, 2 hours or 3 hours. And then the satellite images from that particular time slot would be fed back into the intelligence system and be utilized in whatever way was necessary.
God, that's another indication of America's power. You know, over the hundreds of years that it has built its power, it's just on so many. There's so many layers of that power, isn't there? Because they had the power there in the situation you're talking about, to give you the right to use the satellites, but only for a limited time slot.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, America has huge power, and the interesting thing now in this age is that power is still there. It may be a diminishing power, but I mean, their ability to spend money on armaments, on surveillance tools, on satellites and drones is huge. And I mean, no other country in the world, although some are catching up, like China and Japan to some extent, but no other country can afford to spend so much money on surveillance. So you've got this funny balance and progression and power and power in the world, where the Americans, one has to say, is a diminishing power, probably for various reasons, and the Chinese and the Japanese and other countries are beginning to develop and be able to afford to experiment and bring in more technology to what they're doing.
Mm. And the other dimension that satellites very obviously bring is that what it added was a layer of information that you didn't have before. So prior to that, your knowledge was either visual or conversational from your embassies around the world, and also audio, but you didn't have that macro ability to be able to look at something. So it gave you visuals that you didn't have before. How did that change what you could find out, and just your confidence, I suppose, in the information that you were gathering?
Well, that's colossal. And I mean, even now you can see, especially the Americans, but also Pakistan to some extent, India, China, have this ability to pinpoint targets. And then, I mean, not large areas, but really precise targets. They can do that by using drones or satellites in certain instances, where they're not the orbital, not the equatorial satellites, but the others. As they have an uneven trajectory around the world, and so they come close in some parts of the world, and then way out into space, and then they come back again on a trajectory that brings them quite close to the Earth. So some of the surveillance from that aspect is quite precise and certainly useful. I can remember them in the 70s, maybe late 60s, being cock-a-hoop, because for the first time they had been able to identify a tennis ball in some of the shots that we were taking. So yeah, but I mean, drones are incredible now. They get so close, they're controlled at distance. I mean, you know, if you look at America and some of the terrorist plans they've had, where they've killed various terrorists, mainly in places like Pakistan and Afghanistan, where there's a lot of movement of terrorist activity. But I mean, now you can sit in Washington in an office in NSA or wherever and look at close-up video of, I don't know, somewhere in Pakistan, and actually identify people, and because they're armed with really heavy arms, some of these drones, so you can get 2 or 3 people in an office saying, "Yeah, that's looking at some computer confirmation that those are the people they're trying to annihilate. Press a button, and that's it. Bye bye." So it's frightening.
It's just incredible, isn't it? And we'll touch on technology and its role throughout other podcasts as we move forward in time. I was just going to ask you, Dad, about the facilities that the British government held, under lease or ownership in Turkey. So you had the embassy in Istanbul, where you were based.
No, it's a consulate in Istanbul.
Oh, was it the consulate?
The consulate, yeah. The embassy in Ankara.
Yeah. So the consulate. What's the difference between an embassy and a consulate?
Well, a consulate is a Commonwealth.
Okay.
And an Ankara, yeah. So that
and an embassy.
And an embassy is a full-blown. It's like some of the big countries, like China and Japan and so on, all have embassies. I think the differentiation is that Commonwealth is consulate, and capitals and so on are
fascinating. But you also had listening stations at Sinop on the Black Sea coast, and I'm not sure where else. But how did you use those outlying locations from your base in Istanbul, and where were they?
Well, it was mainly from Ankara that was controlled. I mean, there was some dialogue between Istanbul and Sinop and Uni, but I think that was not that important. But certainly in Ankara, the control of Sinop, which was a satellite surveillance system, keeping an eye on, again, the Russians and their technology and radar. And Unya was a smaller concern, also along the lines of keeping a look on Russia and making sure that nothing new was happening. So these two, they were about 100 miles apart, I guess, on the Black Sea coast. And the Americans, at Sinop, they had a similar facility, probably with different interests. So there were quite a number of satellite dishes there, pointing north towards the Black Sea and Crimea, and that's quite an interesting.
And it's somewhere
area
that we used to go up to Sinop and other places along the Black Sea coast on holiday, didn't we?
Yes, we did. That was incredible, because Turkey is like no other country I've been in. It's full of surprises. It's full of history. It's full of geological wonders. It's full of mountains and small villages and places that you'd never think there people could live. So very, very interesting. And I think some of the holidays that we spent, both from Istanbul and from Ankara, were one of the most enjoyable parts of being in Turkey. It was just so different. People are so hospitable, so eager to look after you, especially when you're off the beaten track. Food was wonderful. It was just an incredible country.
I agree. It's. I think Turkey's probably my favorite country. We've traveled a lot as a family and as individuals, but I don't think anywhere really touches Turkey for, just as you've said, the richness of its culture and its history, but also just the people are lovely and so welcoming, aren't they? And they love to learn about you and to show them their country and their ways.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, can you remember, what age were you then? You're born in...
I was born in...
So
yeah, so I must have been... I was old enough to remember it well. I mean, I spoke Turkish and played with local Turkish kids in Istanbul. So, yeah, right. I remember a lot about it, where we lived, how we lived, and our holidays. And I think probably the holidays that I don't remember the Black Sea coast quite so well, but I do remember we used to holiday to a holiday house that the consulate had, which was at Gallipoli.
Yes, yeah, that stands out in my memories too, because you were so interested even at the age you were, and because it was so close to where the action took place in the First World War at Gallipoli. The trenches were only I guess, a couple of 100 meters from the holiday home that the consulate had. And we used to tramp around looking for souvenirs from the First World War. And I think you found on one occasion part of a rifle that had washed up on the beach and was partially buried in the sand. I think it may have been a 303, but everything had corroded except the butt and the trigger. The barrel had gone too. So, and we had that for many years. I can't remember what happened to it, but and also some of the remnants of what was left in terms of equipment. Billy cans used to pop up now and again. Again, partially rusted. Ammunition used to appear, and it was and it was so close. I mean, you could go up and walk along the trenches and get some idea of how difficult it must have been. And of course, the War Graves Commission had huge areas where headstones were for all the people that were known to have perished in the Gallipoli. And most of those were, I think, Australians and New Zealanders, Anzacs. And I mean, it's worth a week on its own just going there and looking and thinking about the carnage that took place. And again, as we often discuss, the difference between what soldiers and the fighting elements of armies had to endure with perhaps not very good support from the superiors and from the officers who were in charge of what was happening. That was very much the case at Gallipoli. And I think the thing that I can remember you asking questions about, where were the Turkish lines and where were the British and Anzac forces trenches, and I mean, they're mostly overgrown now, but when you look at them, you think, my God, they're only 20 meters apart. And so they were that close. It was an incredible campaign. And the stories abound of Christmas time, when all those troops were stuck in the trenches and in the bunkers, and of having a sort of a 2-day break when the Turks threw grapes into the Allied forces trenches, and the Allied forces threw tins of corned beef, bully beef, to the Turks. So they had a celebration for 2 days, and then carnage resumed, presumably on the third day. And I mean, again, we visualized the carnage that took place, especially again with the New Zealanders and the Australians who climbed, trying to take some of the Turkish trenches, who were just massacred. They kept going, they kept coming, piles and piles of bodies. That was incredible to think of the carnage that did take place.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I remember Gallipoli well. I remember coming back one morning with a shell, a whole shell from the beach, and understandably, you were very, very concerned that it was still live. But you handled it so well. I do remember that. And you took me to a guy who had a yard where a Turkish guy, and he gathered all sorts of old military equipment from the beaches in this yard. And you took me to him with the shell, and he was just as all the Turks are, so gracious. He took the shell from me and said, right, just choose something that you would like. And so I think I picked a bayonet, and which I've still got, and the half the casings of an old hand grenade, which I've still got. So I remember that, just the wonder of walking along the beaches and finding this stuff and knowing that it had been part of a war and a battle. And it's just...
Well, I'd forgotten that. Was that in Kuchukanafarta, the little village?
I don't know, Dad. I mean, but I do remember that. But that's a good. I love that name of that village, Kuchukanafarta, and that became a very precious place for us as a family, didn't it?
That's right. We got friendly with the Mukhtar, who was the head man at Kuchukanafarta, and it was, I guess, half a mile, probably less, from the holiday home that we were living in. And like all Turkish people, they're so generous, and on one occasion, the Mukhtar said, my Turkish was reasonable at the time, but not that good. And of course, dialects and so on in some of these areas in Turkey are so pronounced that you don't understand what they're saying. You see, so he was obviously inviting us on this occasion to something. So he eventually went and got his 12 bore and showed it to us, and then started pointing into the bush around the village, grunting like pigs, and he. It was obvious that he wanted to go and hunt wild boar, because there were a lot of wild boar at that time in that part of the country. So a couple of days later, we arrived at the village, and I think you, Jane, you were probably too young at the time because it can be quite a dangerous occasion. Some of the wild boars, the males, are big beasts and have long, sharp, curly tusks. And so anyway, we set off with half a dozen Turkish people with 12 bores, and they used as ammunition. They used a single ball in some of them, rather than shot that scattered, because it took a lot of stopping some of the big wild boars. So off we set, and we could hear them. We could hear them snuffling around in the undergrowth, and the dogs barking. They were trying to flush them. But after a day, we had no success. So that was that. And then the story is that a couple of weeks later, we were in the consulate in Istanbul, working one morning, and one of the guards on duty at the gate, the main gate, phoned up and said, "Mr. Craigie, someone wants to see you at the main gate." So I thought, wonder who this is. I wonder what this is. And he didn't say anything other than someone wants to see you. So down I went. There was a taxi driver, smiling, gold teeth, smiling, beaming all over his face. And he spoke to the guard, who spoke some English, and they opened the boot, and lo and behold, there was a dead wild boar in the boot, and it absolutely filled the boot. It was a brute of a thing. So here was I, standing there thinking, what the heck do I do now? So the guard on duty said, "Oh, I know. I have a friend," which is quite a common thing in Turkey. Everyone has friends that they can use. So they transferred the wild boar carcass into another taxi, and it was whistled off to the guard's friend. And that afternoon, when we finished work, it reappeared in the back of a taxi, all cut up and carved, ready for the pot. So it was just another remarkable indication of how hospitable and how caring the Turks are, because Gallipoli was about 3 hours, I guess, maybe 4 hours drive from the consulate. So it was all good. And the all that wild boar meat was distributed among the people in the consulate, and some made curries, some made stews, some put it in the freezer, but it was lovely meat.
I bet it was. And yeah, the Turks are just such gracious people, aren't they? And I think that's a real indication of just the way that they are. And it's the other two places that we went to regularly on holiday, which don't have quite such a hold on me, but were beautiful and at the time really untouched, were Marmaris and Pamukkale.
Yes, they were fantastic places. I think you went to Marmaris on one occasion when I didn't go, but Pamukkale was an amazing place. It was it was called Pamukkale because that's the Turkish for cotton castle. And they looked like cotton castles because there's a lot of a thermal activity there, and this reddishy brown. Can you remember the colour of that water at Pamukkale?
Yeah, I do.
It was either red or brown because I'm colourblind. I'm never quite sure what
It was brown.
Brown. Yeah, and it used to run down the hills and appear a bit lower down, quite hot, very hot. In fact, some of the springs that were there. So what they had done was it created a holiday facility there, so you could live right next to the pools that they had created with this hot spring water. So in the morning you could get out of bed, put your swimming trunks on, and just pop into the water right next to your chalet. So it was a wonderful place. And I believe now that they've had to close it because of the damage done by tourists walking on the white deposits that are everywhere. So I think it's closed now.
I think you're right. And as always, Dad, you explored, and you know, we're very grateful that you did. You explored the country very, very widely, and often going off the beaten track. Tell us a little bit about the lifestyle in Turkey, what that was like. So holidays were a part of it, but also the being in the consulate itself, what that life was like.
Yeah, the consulate was quite laid back. It was more laid back than the embassy in Ankara, which is what you would expect. There's a lot of locally employed people there who one such I remember was called Richard de Leon, a very interesting guy who we used to discuss and say, I wonder what he's doing. Is he part of the Turkish intelligence effort or something? But he was a lovely guy, and I mean, it's a very sociable place. It was a smaller, I suppose there must have been about 40 people there, and we all knew each other, and we had some fabulous places to go. We used to frequent Boğaziçi University, where we had friends who were lecturers at the university. We used to congregate there at the weekends, but there were also places in Turkey. I mean, particularly around the Bosphorus, there are so many things to look at. Dolmabahce Palace. They had the place we used to go at the weekends was called Tarabya, which was another garden that the sultans and so on used to use in bygone times. It had kind of fallen into disuse, but it used to serve us well for picnics and so on. And we had a bar in the consulate, and I mean, the places to eat were just phenomenal because we were just off the Istiklal Caddesi, which is the main thoroughfare in Istanbul, at least it was at that time. And it was full of doner kebab places. There was one vast restaurant that they called the Church. And at one time it had been a church in the past, but they had converted it to being a restaurant, and you could go in there, point at the meat you wanted, and then sit in front of the charcoal kebab barbecues and poke away at it and help the cooks to provide the meal. So it was all very, very hospitable and congenial. And the bar was an interesting place because everyone used to congregate on a Friday, of course, to chat. And I can remember on one occasion we were sitting at the bar, and the bar was quite a long bar. I think much bigger than the consulate deserved. But anyway, we had a couple of barmen and a mirror that stretched all the way behind the bar, and we were friendly with the naval attaché, Joe Wise, if I recall, and we were in there on this occasion, a Friday, 5 o'clock when the offices closed, and Joe came in with an elderly man, and he said, "Oh, this is my father. He's out for a few days." So we were introduced to Joe's father. We sat down at the bar, and quite a number of people along the bar, and there's another old gentleman came in with somebody else, obviously on holiday and so on. So he came in and he was introduced around, and so he sat at one end of the bar, and Joe and his father at the other end of the bar. And as the night went on, after 2 or 3 drinks, we kind of noticed that the Joe's father at one end of the bar, and the other person, the elderly man, the other end of the bar, kept looking at each other in the mirror, and it was quite obvious that there was some sort of interest between them. So that went on for a while, and all of a sudden, Joe's father leapt up and walked towards this other elderly gentleman and said, "Kipper, it's you, Kipper, I knew it's you." And Kipper said, I can't remember what Joe Wise's by name was, but it transpired that they were at Gallipoli and were part of one of the platoons or whatever, and they were gunners who had to go when they were marching and moving. They had to guard them, and it just so happened that one had the responsibility, one end of the platoon, and the other elderly guy was at the front end of the platoon. How's that for coincidence?
Wow. I bet you wish now that you'd asked so many more questions of those two old guys.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, well.
You should have been there, Jane.
Yeah, I'd love to have done a podcast with them.
Yeah, a podcast and that would be good, yeah.
Well, Dad, that was amazing once again. And as usual, when we get towards the end of a podcast, it's about lunchtime. So I think we'll leave it there for now. And I think the next one, well, we'll have to have a chat about what we do next. But maybe the next one, we'll go back in time and talk about our holiday in Afghanistan. What do you think to that?
Yeah, that's good. And there's so much happening in Afghanistan at the moment that it would be very interesting. And it'd be good too. I mean, all those people that we've had contact with who have listened to the podcasts, thank you very much, because it means a lot.
Yeah. That
you're entertaining people and that they get some sort of comfort perhaps and understanding of what went on at that time.
Yeah, I agree, Dad. It's been so heartening and humbling to hear from so many people who've listened to your story, to our story. Yeah, and I'd like to add my thanks as well.
Very well, thanks, Jenny. That was good fun.
And to you, Dad. And look after yourself. And we'll catch up again soon.
You too. Okay, thank you.